Right, we've got a presentation, a very important presentation. First battle, first victory, the Sydney Emden by Kes. Kes, 40 years history teacher, and has coached to win some very prestigious awards. But to give something back and really be involved in something, being involved in teaching training at the Sydney Uni is one important way to influence how things are done. And his special interest is in military and naval history. If he was a history teacher when I went to school, I would have paid a lot more attention. The history, all the British kings and queens, etc., didn't grab me too much. Kes is a guide and a speaker at the Maritime Museum, similar to myself. And just to fill in the time, he's a musician and he's a motoring enthusiast. So over to you, Kes.
Thank you very much, Noel. And I'm sure that if I was a teacher when you were at school, you definitely would have paid attention to me or else. Okay, so today's topic, first victory, of course, that was the title of a recent book. And you'll probably see that we have an anniversary coming up next year, 2024, for this battle. Okay, so it was indeed the first victory and the first battle of the Royal Australian Navy. It was somewhat one-sided, but a very interesting story nonetheless. And there are a few aspects to this story that I certainly was not aware of at first. For instance, the famous poet A.B. Patterson, or Banjo Patterson, had a hand in what happened after the battle. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so I used a number of books as my source material, but this was a book that I was able to purchase at the Maritime Museum. It was especially what you would call, I suppose, put out as a limited edition. And the fellow that wrote this book actually had a relative who was in World War I. He wasn't on Sydney, but he had a connection to Banjo Patterson, and I won't go into the whole detail, but it's an excellent book, and it's probably hard to find, but if you can find it, you'll find some excellent photographs in there and information. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the two ships and the men who commanded and sailed in them. We're going to look at the prelude to the actual battle itself. So this will be mainly about Emden, because I'm sure you're all aware SMS Emden became a legend in the first year of the war, not just to the Central Powers, but to the Allied powers as well, and certainly a media sensation. We'll very quickly look at how Emden's landing party behaved and how they were employed on the island of Cocos Island. And the main part of this presentation will be about the battle between the Sydney and the Emden. We'll briefly look at the fate of the landing party. And I mean, you could actually put a presentation together just on what happened to these German sailors after the battle and how they got away and the adventures they went through. Indeed, there was a movie made, a German movie about that. And the fate of the actual ships and men, it's a wonder actually that, as far as I know, if you go looking for the wreck of the Emden, you can't find it, and there's a reason for that. Okay, so first of all, HMAS Sydney. HMAS Sydney was part of the fleet unit that sailed into Sydney Harbour just before World War I, which of course included the first flagship, HMAS Australia, the Indefatigable class battle cruiser. The Sydney and the Melbourne were the light cruiser component. There would be also Brisbane and eventually Adelaide would be built along the same lines, although slightly modified. These were quite powerful ships. They were classified as light cruisers, but for their time, they were extremely modern as compared to what had passed before as light cruisers and very heavily armed. So it was indeed a very valuable addition to the Royal Australian Navy just before World War I. The commanding officer of HMAS Sydney, Captain John Glossop, and just bear in mind that both commanders of Sydney and Emden are gentlemen of the old school. They believe in things like honor, respect, but also, of course, doing their duty to the utmost in a war situation. So Glossop, like Nelson, as a lot of people like to note, was the son of a clergyman, a man of peace, but Glossop himself had more of an interest in joining the Navy than joining the church. And as a junior officer, he actually served in ships on the Australia station. And he was 47 years old when the battle occurred. And like the German commander, he had never heard a shot fired in anger until this really cataclysmic battle between Sydney and Emden. Okay, and here's a great shot of the crew of Sydney after the battle. As you can see there, I won't use the word motley crew, but they're justly happy to have survived, and of course, very happy that they won the battle. They came from all over Australia, just like in those days, most naval crews did. And they were a very tight ship and a well-trained crew. Now we switch to Emden. Now, Emden is classified as a light cruiser. However, the fact is that Emden was probably more of what you would call a protected cruiser in the parlance of the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is because Emden and the other ships of her class only had armor on the deck. They did not have belt armor. So along the sides of the ship, it was totally unprotected. Emden also, because before the war, it was such a well turned out ship, it was called the Swan of the East. That was its nickname when it was on the China station. The commanding officer of Emden, Karl von Müller, a younger man than Glossop. He was a very quiet and studious person. His whole life was pretty much the Navy. He was a Prussian, and funnily enough, because most Prussian young men who came from the petty nobility, and if you have the word von in your name, that means you are from that petty nobility, were in the army. However, he preferred to transfer to the Navy. He became a gunnery officer, which was like the British Navy, the creme de la creme of the Navy. If you were in the Royal Navy or if you were in the German Navy, the most sought after spot was to be a gunnery officer. And of course, this didn't hurt when he became a member of the Kaiser's brother's staff. The Kaiser's brother, one of his royal appointments was to actually have an honorary high rank as Grand Admiral in the German Navy. And so this was the reason for von Müller being appointed. And then perhaps because of his connections, he was appointed commander of the Emden itself. 41 years old at the time of the battle. And just to how can we say, illustrate what kind of a personality he was, he could have made a lot of money to write a book after World War I about his exploits of the battle, but he refused. And I think maybe one of the reasons he refused is because of what he saw during the battle on his own ship. And what I mean by that is the absolute horror and destruction that was rained on the Emden, he didn't feel probably that he wanted to make money out of something like that. Okay, here's a great shot of the crew of the Emden, or I should say part of what was left of the crew of the Emden. Over half the crew were killed in the battle, which should tell you something. This is a shot of the crew as prisoners of war in Malta. It's typical of the German Navy in World War I should say, in the early part of World War I, that they are completely superbly turned out. They are part of the ship's choir, because when you're a prisoner of war, you need to do stuff. And one of the things they did was to have a ship's choir. And, you know, if you put Australian uniforms on these guys, you probably would not know the difference. Okay, so now we're going to switch to the events that happened before the battle itself. I mentioned before that there were German ships on what were called the China Station. Okay, so this was the German Far East Squadron. They were in company with ships from many other nationalities based in China before World War I, including, of course, Great Britain. They were based at Tsingtao, or Tsingtao, as it's called now, in China. And they did one thing that was everlasting for China. They built the best brewery that ever existed in China. And to this day, the best beer you can buy that comes from China comes from the same brewery that the Germans built there in their legation, in their area of influence. Von Spee had a very powerful force, 2 armored and 4 light cruisers. Now, these 2 armored cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, had the most highly, I mean, all of these ships were highly trained, because von Spee, one of his areas of expertise was training. And like von Muller, he was an expert at gunnery. And Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, these 2 ships jointly held the prize for gunnery in the whole German fleet. And that includes all the battleships, battle cruisers, everything. These 2 ships were the best shooters in the whole German Navy. And so therefore, at the outbreak of war, one of the first things that the Admiralty, the British Admiralty, wanted to do was to hunt down this squadron and destroy it, simply because it represented a massive threat to shipping, such as troop ships coming from Australia and New Zealand to the Middle East, or, of course, all the supplies of food and other war materials passing between Europe and Asia. But von Spee was like Rommel in World War II. He was a very foxy, cunning man, and he was able to escape for a long time all the searches that were sent out to him, or to find him, I should say. Now, they had a meeting at a rendezvous, all the German ships. They had a conference of the commanding officers, and von Muller from the Emden put forward to von Spee that he thought it would be a really good idea to actually break away from the main German squadron and to raise hell in the Indian Ocean and the Java Sea, around that area, to decoy Allied ships away from looking for von Spee's squadron. And also, of course, as he said, to raise as much hell as possible by sinking Allied merchant ships and any warships that they could. Von Spee was, at first, not really amenable to this idea, but von Muller was insistent. And in the end, even von Spee had to think very much on this and actually ended up agreeing. So Emden was detached, and von Spee's squadron sailed away to their fate. First of all, a victory at Coronel against a British squadron under Admiral Craddock, and then, of course, a bitter defeat at the hands of British battle cruisers at the Battle of the Falklands Islands. But anyway, that's another story. We are going to follow the Emden. So for 2 months, Emden, as they said, raced hell in this part of the world. If you can look at the map, I'm sure you can see where we are. Indonesia, or what we call today Indonesia, or the Dutch East Indies to the northeast, Southeast Asia, India, all around this area. They were able to shell oil tanks at Madras and captured 25 merchant ships in the period between August to November. And as I say there, this ship became a celebrated media sensation. Okay, newspapers all over the world were reporting about the Emden. It was like a phantom ship. It appeared from nowhere. It captured or sunk Allied vessels, especially capturing any ships that carried coal to keep, because of course Emden needed coal to keep going. And at one stage, I think Emden had about 4 or 5 merchant ships carrying coal with prize crews aboard that was sent to various areas to rendezvous with Emden to make sure the Emden can keep cruising. One of the things that was said about Muller in the newspapers of the time was his chivalrous behavior. Okay, most of these ships were only sunk, obviously nearly all of these ships were nearly sunk when the crews were safe and off the ship. There was no, as the media would later call it, no Schweinhund behavior from von Muller. Okay, and one of the most daring things that Emden did was to enter the harbor at Penang, which is on the west coast of Malaya, as it was called in those days. And he took his ship into the harbor. And one of the things, as we'll see, is that Emden had rigged up a 4th dummy funnel to make it look like a British cruiser. And it sailed boldly into Penang harbor. And as it sailed in, it saw on a starboard side the Russian cruiser, another light cruiser called Zemchuk. And here on the map from New York Times, it's called Jemchuk, but it was actually spelt with a Z. And of course, the Russian Navy in World War I was not what you would call the most efficient Navy, and probably still isn't. And the fact is that the captain of Zemchuk was ashore visiting his mistress. 3/4 of the crew were also ashore, probably visiting the local establishments that served alcohol and other things. And the crew that was aboard the Russian warship were mostly asleep. There were no watches, and Emden shelled and torpedoed Zemchuk, and basically it broke up and sank. It then did a circuit, but realized that there were a lot of Allied warships, mainly destroyers, that were getting up steam. There had been a wonderful target, the oil tanks from the Asiatic Petroleum Company, but von Muller decided, okay, maybe I better get out of here. And so he then left the harbor. As he was leaving the harbor, a French destroyer was sailing in, challenged Emden, went to battle stations, and was promptly sunk by accurate gunfire from Emden. So sinking 2 Allied warships and then disappearing. Now, this is all leading up to the other participant in the battle, HMAS Sydney. So what is Sydney doing at the beginning of November? At the beginning of November, Sydney was part of a convoy that was forming up to take Australian soldiers from the AIF to Egypt eventually. And it's interesting to note that the Australian ship was really not the only, or the Australian and British ships involved were not the only navies involved. There were a couple of Japanese, well, they were really battle cruisers. Ibuki was one of them. And this Allied fleet was then to sail towards the Middle East. And as they did, of course, they were going to pass the Cocos Islands. Now, aboard one of the merchant ships that were carrying the troops was a fellow that we all know, of course, from poems like The Man from the Snowy River, and this was A.B. Banjo Patterson. He had been given a job as war correspondent to the Sydney Herald and Melbourne Age, these two newspapers that I think actually obviously still exist to this day. So he was actually there mainly because of what he would see as a war correspondent in land warfare, but he was able to get a massive scoop when he would interview Captain Glossop after the battle. And we're going to find out a lot about that. So as they sailed away from the ports in Western Australia, the flagship, the convoy flagship, which was a British ship, and forgive me, I forget the name of the ship, intercepted a distress signal from the radio station on Cocos Island. Emden is here. And the Japanese battle cruiser Ibuki signaled the flagship, you know, look, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna sink this German ship. And of course, it would have been even more one-sided if that was the case, because Ibuki was pretty much twice the size of Sydney. But he was overruled, and maybe with a view to blooding the Australian Navy, the British commander sent Sydney to intercept at full speed. And you'll see a number of these excellent paintings that illustrate not only HMAS Sydney, but the battle itself. They come from various sources, and they are really amazing pieces of art and history. Okay, so Emden is here, and this is actually a computer simulation. You can see there Emden's fourth fake funnel. And again, they were trying to pretend that they were a British warship, but somebody had sharp eyes on Cocos Island. Actually, it was on Direction Island, I think, where the radio station was. And they could see that it was a fake, and they could remember that, I think Emden has a fake fourth funnel. And of course, this was going to be the harbinger of doom for Emden when they sent out the radio signal. So just to get our bearings, this map shows us exactly where the Cocos Islands are in relation to the west coast of Australia and, of course, Indonesia, etc. 2,700 kilometers northwest of Perth. It was taken over by the British, and as in so many other parts of vast oceans, the British had outposts there where they had a wireless station, and this became a very attractive target. This is why the Emden was there, because they wanted to destroy the wireless station, which was something very important for the Admiralty, the Royal Navy, and also to basically get any supplies that they could lay their hands on while they were there. But this would be a fateful decision indeed. Here are another couple of maps. This shows you on the left, in relation, the area in which the battle took place. So as it says there, the Direction Island is exactly where the wireless station was. You can see there the massive entrance to the islands, and also to the North Keeling Island. Now, this is the area in which the battle took place, and on the right, this gives you a detail so you can see the configuration of the islands itself. So when Emden approached Direction Island, they put together a landing party under Helmut von Mucke. Now, von Mucke was a fanatical German officer in his belief, but also he was a very good officer, a very good leader of men, and he was put in charge because of his experience in handling the men and also because of his reliability. So they were to land, destroy the wireless station and ocean cables, which were another means of communication, and then return to Emden with whatever they could get. This is a photograph, a still from the German movie called The Men of the Emden, and it basically detailed not so much the battle, but the actual story of the sailors from the Emden and their legendary, you'd have to say, epic escape from that part of the world all the way to Turkey, which is pretty much halfway around the world, if not more. So you can see there that they're really heavily armed. At this stage of the war, they were expecting, they didn't really know what to expect. So they were ready just in case. They had a couple of heavy machine guns. They had enough firepower to take on a small British garrison. But of course, there were no British soldiers on the island, and it was not necessary. They immediately marched on the wireless station, and distress signals were being sent out right up until the time that the soldiers burst in and decided to smash everything up. Everything was destroyed. The undersea cables were cut eventually because they were quite strong and thick, and the mast was felled. And as the German soldiers were chopping down the radio antenna, the mast, a couple of the guys from the radio station or the wireless station came out and implored the German soldiers, make sure it falls over there because we don't want you to damage the tennis court. And the Germans obliged. And one other thing that caused a lot of sorrow was that von Mucke, as a very correct German officer and probably thinking that he didn't want maybe a bunch of drunks on his hands, whether they were his own men or the other people, they found a cache. That's not a case, by the way. That's a cache, meaning a big load of Scotch whiskey, and they smashed it all to pieces. So there were a lot of sad-looking faces around the island for a long time after that. And then what happened is they could hear explosions. And it's very hard to see on this photo. But if you sort of see towards the midsection, right out on the horizon, you can see a couple of small, I suppose, they look like little puffs of smoke. They are actually shell hits in the water. So the water is spouting up. And the action with Sydney had begun. And you can imagine the feeling of the German sailors watching this. It was too late to try and get back to the ship, so they had to wait and see what happened. Okay, so we're now going to actually look at the battle itself. Here are the two contenders, and this is to scale also, by the way. So you can see that Sydney is a much more powerful looking ship. Obviously, it has a bigger main armament. It's altogether a superior ship. Emden is probably from an earlier generation of warships. One of the things that strike you straight away, the bow of HMAS Sydney is what we would call perhaps a clipper bow, whereas Emden has the old-fashioned 19th century ram-style bow. So that those two things, more than anything, show the difference in the generations between these ships. Here is a comparison of the things that matter in a naval battle as far as the ships are concerned. So Emden had more guns, but they were placed perhaps in not a very advantageous way. And actually Sydney's weren't that advantageous either. But Sydney's guns fired shells that weighed 100 pounds. Okay, so the shot, armor piercing, high explosive and shrapnel, a 100-pound gun or 100-pound shells, and Emden shells weighed only 32 pounds. So who's going to do more damage? Obviously, the heavier weight of shell will tell. As I said before, the armor, belt armor is non-existent on Emden. Its deck armor is 2 to 3 inches as opposed to uniform 3-inch, 3-inch belt and 2 to 3 inch on the deck. And finally, speed. Sydney can do 25.5 knots, and it was able to do that actually, whereas Emden was supposed to be able to do 23 knots. I have an asterisk there because after being at sea for many months, the bottom was foul, and it was lucky if it could do 19 to 20 knots. So obviously a massive disadvantage. Both ships actually had torpedo tubes, but only Emden would attempt to use them, and only attempt. Okay, so at the beginning of the battle, HMAS Sydney was charging like a bull at a gate. They charged straight towards Emden, trying to make up the quickest time possible to get into range and attack Emden. And they had already realized that, you know, well, Emden has only got 4-inch guns. We got 6-inch guns. And that means that Emden, you know, it really can't be accurate, you know, at around 8,000, 9,000 yards, certainly not at 10,000 yards. And for us, our guns at 10,000 yards, we'll be smacking them, no problem. And this actual, I think this is actually a pencil drawing. You can see Sydney charging in and giving that sense of power and fire and beginning to fire. And you can see the shell splashes straight away. But what Sydney did not know, and when I say Sydney, I mean the crew and the commander officer of Sydney didn't know, is that Emden's crew were extremely well trained, especially the gunnery. You may remember I told you that von Muller was an expert gunnery officer. He had trained his men, and that they were indeed very much able to score hits on Sydney at a maximum range of 10,500 yards, which was unbelievable for Captain Glossop. And not only that, but these hits nearly caused Glossop to lose his life. And here is what he said to Banjo Patterson after the battle. Well, I had a lot of luck, didn't I? I got a shock when she fired at us at 10,500 yards, and her shells came on board us. A shell passed, killed a man working the rangefinder, but it never burst. I was in that control. If it had burst, I would have been a goner. And this is one of the problems for Emden, for whatever reason, whether it was age or whether perhaps they weren't fused properly, the shells, a lot of them did not burst. Okay, so Glossop would have been killed if that shell had burst in the area where he was. As it was, the shell is still, or the actual projectile is still a chunk of steel, and it cut a man in half, and the body of that man fell on top of one of the ship's boys, 16-year-old fellow, and Glossop's commentary on that was, a boy of 16 was lying under the dead man. He threw the body off and started looking. Where's me bloody telescope? Was all he said. Well, that's the Australian Navy for you. So in other words, something as horrific as that didn't faze this boy of 16, and Glossop thought, hey, that's the Australian Navy for sure. So after that lucky escape, Sydney decides to open up the range and starts hitting on Emden with its superior firepower. And as you can see here, like Emden, it does have guns that are on both sides of the ship. And this is typical World War I cruiser. Instead of having all the guns on the center line, like they would in a World War II cruiser, you had guns on each broadside. So that halved your firepower. However, when you have 100-pound shells versus 32-pound shells, you're going to do a hell of a lot more damage. And eventually, Sydney, because it was also a well-trained crew, were able to find the range and to start hitting consistently. And here's a photograph. And I'm not sure if this was actually taken during the action, but here you see the typical, I mean, these guns, these 6-inch guns were ubiquitous in the Royal Navy and in the Australian Navy, in all British Empire ships at this time. So that's the 6-inch BL Mark 7. As I said, it fires a 100-pound shell. You can see the gun crew behind. They are passing up the projectiles and bags of cordite, because these shells were not one piece. They were 2 pieces, meaning you had the projectile and a silk bag that had cordite to be used to actually propel the shell. Much bigger, and you'll see later, right at the end of the presentation, and I'm sure you've seen it in Hyde Park, the size of the 4-inch gun compared to this. This is a serious naval gun. And of course, outranged the 4-inch guns of Emden easily. Okay, so more from the Patterson interview. I had the speed and guns on her, but if our people had not served those guns properly, or she dropped the shell into our engine room, we might have been sent to the bottom. We hit the Emden about 100 times in 40 minutes. Okay, so you just think of that. 100 times in 40 minutes. That's 2 shells every minute hitting the ship. Her shells were fired beyond her range, and the shells hit the side and dropped into the water without exploding. So again, Emden shells were not doing what they should have done. But even if they had, that 3-inch belt of armor on the side of Sydney would have negated a lot of damage, even if they had exploded. Not long after this situation, Emden was aflame from pretty much the bridge all the way back. The funnels, as you can see, had collapsed. Many of the crew had been killed or severely wounded. And at this stage, von Muller still trying to fight his ship. He's not surrendering, and he's slowing down, trying to lure Sydney closer so he can launch torpedoes. But of course, Glossop is not stupid, and Glossop decides, no, this is obviously a trick, and I will open up the range and I will start smashing Emden again. And of course, that's exactly what he did. And pretty much Sydney speeds out of range and starts again longer range gunnery, although you can see there that that's still pretty point blank range in relative terms. And Emden by this time is pretty much a wreck that is barely going and only sporadically firing back, and very uneven fire. At one stage, von Muller was able to actually turn the ship around, was actually before this, and to get his, I think of the port side battery that hadn't been firing yet, but they were quickly silenced, and Muller had to turn around anyway, because he quickly realized that the only hope that this ship had was to beach itself, because otherwise it would sink. Okay, so here is the plan of the tracks of HMAS Sydney and Emden during the battle. As you can see there, a lot of maneuvering. And I'm not going to go into it completely, but The numbers, if you see a number 2 on Sydney and a number 2 on the track of Emden, that shows you where they were relative to each other at that stage of the battle. And a number 8 and a number 8 and so on and so forth. But as you can see, a lot of maneuvering, and eventually Emden has to beach itself on North Keeling Island in the top left-hand part of the map. These photos show you what kind of carnage was on Emden. Okay, so the situation aboard Emden was horrific. The dead and wounded were everywhere, and we'll see what Glossop had to say about that later. They were obviously extremely courageous. You have a look at the wheelhouse. Okay, somebody's trying to con the ship from that area to turn the ship, to steer the ship, etc. You can only imagine what kind of hell that must have been. And on the foredeck, you see where the shells have ripped holes in the deck. I mean, the two-inch armor plating was certainly not enough to stop. And you can see the open gun shields of Emden's 4-inch guns, one to port, one to starboard. You wouldn't have been there for long when that shell ripped that deck open. Okay, and again, a very famous photo of Emden as it was beached on North Keeling Island. So he beached the ship. Sydney approached and asked for Emden to surrender. Okay, so as happened in the early part of the war so much, the Germans did not surrender. As you probably know, the way to surrender is to lower your ensign. And I don't know how in that destruction they still had an ensign flying, but apparently they did. Von Muller, knowing that perhaps if they didn't lower their ensign, they're going to receive another broadside, grabbed as many of the men who were still alive. And as you see that central tower in the photograph, that's the conning tower. They went behind the conning tower because it had, I think, probably about 2 or 3 inches of armor plate. It was some sort of shelter. When Sydney repeated the request for the ship to surrender, what happened next is they poured 2 broadsides into Emden until somebody realized that I think we better lower the ensign, and they had satisfied honor at the cost of probably another 30 or 40 sailors being killed, and the ship surrendered. So here's Glossop's take on that. I asked several times, but no answer. I fired 2 salvos and they hauled their flag down. I was very sorry afterwards that I gave her those 2 salvos. We sent boats to the Emden. My God, what a sight. Everybody on board her was demented by shock and fumes. She was a shambles. Blood, guts, flesh, uniforms were all scattered about. And that's something to think about for those men on both sides who had gone to war, like the armies on the Western Front or at Gallipoli, thinking about the glory of war. And, you know, glory sometimes doesn't really enter into it. And this was really one of the situations where people found that war is not, how can we say, all about being glorious and being famous. It's also about horror and death. So one of the, how can you say, noble gestures was at HMS Cerberus. There was stained glass window in the chapel put up that commemorated not only HMAS Sydney, but also the Emden itself. A very noble and chivalrous gesture. And you can see there that HMAS Sydney out of a crew of 376, had 4 killed and 16 wounded. Whereas Emden, out of a crew of 360, 134 killed, 69 wounded, and 157 captured. So you can see there a very one-sided battle. So after the Battle of Von Muller surrendered to Glossop, and he tendered his sword to Glossop, and Glossop allowed him to keep his sword. Again, very chivalrous, very old school. They were both very much like that. The survivors were transferred on board Sydney, and eventually they were transferred to another ship, auxiliary cruiser Empress of Russia, and were then transported to Malta and placed in the custody of the British Army. HMAS Sydney, of course, you can imagine, they were victorious. They had won the battle. There was great relief, and they then rejoined the convoy at Colombo. And as they joined the convoy again, Glossop requested that there would be no cheering and flag waving, etc., because of the German wounded on board. And again, a very chivalrous reaction. And finally, there was no danger of a German raider after the Emden had been destroyed, and troop movements and merchant convoys could move without danger. But what about the landing party? Now, like I said, it's an epic journey. I haven't got time to tell you a lot about it, but the Ayesha was an old 3-masted schooner that was in the harbor at Direction Island, and the German sailors decided that they were not going to hang around to be captured, and they would make a bid to get on the schooner. They were able to get lots of supplies. You can imagine the people on Cocos Islands were only too happy to help the Germans get away because they didn't want the Germans there, obviously. And they gave them lots of food, water, etc. And they went aboard Ayesha. They went to Padang, which is off Sumatra, I think, and then sailed from Padang to Yemen on this leaky old schooner that was pretty much, ready to sink in any storm. I think they had to bail water out of the bottom of the ship almost constantly. The pumps had to be repaired to do this. And then because the ship finally sank, and then eventually they were able to get some Arab dhows that sailed to Jeddah and then crossed overland to Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. I told you this was an epic journey. And then finally from there by train to Constantinople, where the Germans had a very strong naval presence in Turkey because they had given the Turks the battle cruiser Goeben and a light cruiser. And they, you can just imagine this fellow after such a journey walking up and then saluting the German admiral and saying, Lieutenant von Mucker and the crew of the Emden reporting for duty, after such a thing, as if nothing had happened, because that's the attitude of a Prussian officer. And what about HMAS Sydney? Off to North America on the West Indies station, and then with the Grand Fleet. As far as I know, it was not at the Battle of Jutland. It didn't take part in any of the major fleet actions, a little bit like HMAS Australia. It was then returned to Australia and broken up in 1929. And Glossop himself was appointed a companion of the Order of the Bath and retired nicely as a Vice Admiral. And the Emden, well, von Muller was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He probably should have got the Pour le Mérite or the Blue Max, but at the beginning of the war, the Iron Cross First Class was deemed to be very high. And the Kaiser would build another Emden, and the wreck disappeared. It broke up, and the currents pulled her out, and it sank. So if you go to the island looking for this ship on the island, it's not there and hasn't been there for a long time. And if you've been to Hyde Park, you've seen this gun, and you could see the difference in size between this 4-inch gun and the 6-inch gun that was on Sydney. A very big difference indeed. And another memento, shall we say, another memorial, Sydney's bow, that clipper bow under the harbour bridge, and the foremast that all ships must salute. And that's it. Here are the main sources, and I have to acknowledge that this presentation is a modification from an original presentation created by one of my fellow speakers, Ron Ray. And yeah, and here's the sources, and thank you very much.
It was a fantastic presentation, and your other career should be in acting, I think, with your impersonation of Captain Glossop. So very much appreciated, and we look forward to the next presentation from you sometime in the future.